Hi, everyone. This is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. And we have an important episode today because we're going to be talking about emotionally immature parents and sibling estrangement. So, sibling estrangement can be multi layered and require us to understand issues ranging from ego defense mechanisms, narcissistic interactional styles, and attachment issues, just to name a few. Now, today we're going to be talking about another important factor that can spark estrangement within a family, and that's, of course, as we said, emotionally immature parents. So, drawing from Lindsay Gibson's book of the same name, we'll dive deeper into those factors that can affect us and foster sibling estrangement. So, Fern, it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for doing this.
Well, thanks so much for doing it. I think it's such an important topic. It's very deceptive to be raised by an emotionally immature parent, partly because parents present models for us for how to navigate the world. And as a child, you cannot determine and tweeze out whether a parent is mature or not. Sometimes it takes decades to really see who they are and how they defined your life. And I actually work with clients who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and they're only now discovering that they were raised by emotionally immature parents, and that experience defined their sibling relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It comes full circle when you start to understand this, especially, right? And once you have the words to see it for what it is, well, you can't unsee it, right? So,
Yeah.
so important for us to, of course, understand this further. So, this leads us into the start of today's episode, which is what does an emotionally immature parent look like, right? So, generally speaking, a parent that is emotionally immature will be self focused rather than attuning themselves to a child's needs, reacting defensively rather than reflectively, lack accountability, for instance, be unable to repair a situation, right? Feel threatened by a child's emotional needs, fearing they can't meet those needs, prioritizing comfort, self image, and control, regardless of whichever connection they have. Does that start to sound familiar?
Well, what it sounds like to me is that they are creating a very unstable family environment. They foster competition and resentment, and there are persistent misunderstandings between siblings. So
Yeah.
I'm translating to how this relates to siblings in general.
There's so many overlaps with this, especially when it comes to this. And I think it's really, really important for our community to know essentially that this is a thing. We've had more and more people talk about this when it
Mhm.
comes to their own experiences in the support group, in the Facebook group, especially, right? So
Mhm.
it's really, really important that we're talking about this because a lot of times kids don't understand this, right? And when they don't see this at a young age, they tend to react in certain ways. So let's talk about how kids react to this, especially to emotionally immature parents, right?
Mhm.
Children may sacrifice their level of authenticity to please and belong with the parent, right? We've talked before about Gabor Mate's authenticity versus belonging paradigm that comes up, where a lot of
Right, the
times people,
attachment,
yeah, people,
authenticity versus attachment. Yeah, and there is a tendency to fawn in order to get along with people who are very erratic and unpredictable.
yes, yes, especially. So we tend to see this happen and such. And I think that belonging is especially important because when we're talking about attachment, really it is belonging, right? And
Mhm.
I think that children's needs and feelings become less important in these types of dynamics, right? And we've seen this with our community where people end up being chameleons or going into people pleasing mode that tends to happen, especially when they're interacting with their siblings.
Right, that's the fawning piece.
Right? Exactly. Being overly vigilant and over responsibility for other people's moods is something that happens. And becoming conflict avoidant, right? Or of emotional expression. And Gibson states that this is all done for the sake of gaining approval from the parental figure, right?
Right. Or also parentification, where you actually invert the roles and become the parent to your own parent.
Yes, that happens too. And that's the thing that is unfortunate in some dynamics where the maturity is simply not there. So, what does an emotionally immature parent look like? Gibson talks about four different types. And the first type she describes is the emotional parent. Maybe some of our community may know of this. These types of parents live a life that's volatile, intrusive, and inconsistent, really, right? Trying to figure them out, trying to understand what is stable here and such, right?
Yeah, and again, because you don't have any yardstick, this kind of volatility becomes a chaotic environment and a chaotic upbringing, which, by the way, is a risk factor for estrangement.
Absolutely. And number two is the driven parent. They're constantly focused on achievement and recognition in exchange for being emotionally unavailable,
Mhm.
right?
Well, that seems like a way in which you can control things better than human relationships.
Right? Exactly. So, very much a good way to tiptoe around emotions. Um, the third one is the passive parent. They enable anything and everything that happens within the family, failing to ultimately protect the child because they tend to avoid conflict at all cost.
Right. And when you have one who's dominant or driven and then the other who's accommodating, this is a common pattern.
Right? And we've talked about matriarchs and patriarchs within the family where it's important for people to step up rather than enabling and such. And I think that a lot of times when that's not happening, we have what we see here, which is the passive parent.
Hmm.
Number four is the rejecting parent. And this tends to be the type of parent that has difficulties in tolerating dependency and vulnerability, such that they become cold, distant, and dismissive, right? So caring is scary.
Right. And that's sort of an insecure attachment response.
Hmm.
The distance in order to maintain safety.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to mention here that there can be more than one that are present in a family system. It doesn't mean that a person needs to fall just in one category. There can be a few of them that overlap onto themselves, especially.
Right. And when you were talking about the driven parent, I had this fleeting thought, which is sometimes in the driven parent, it's much easier for them to form office relationships and be the father that somebody else wants when they fail at home. So
Right?
it's an interesting experience. They have the paternal instincts, but only in a contained fashion at the office.
Exactly. And that's a great example, right? They do look good, but when it comes to making it at home, different story, right?
Yeah.
So the author of the book, Gibson, states that children either turn their attention, their situation inwardly or outwardly. So, turning inwardly involves becoming self reflective, conscientious, prone to blaming oneself, yet being emotionally aware, right? That's one of the responses people have, children have within these types of family systems that as they grow up and become adults, they can still have this turning inward,
Right. And there's a lot of self-consciousness in that and insecurity because you never know what you say will land.
right? Exactly. So you're constantly watching to see, right, and such. And it's interesting because it kind of overlaps slightly with turning outwardly, blaming others and how they feel, acting out in emotional fashion, expecting others to accommodate them. So it might be that there's that other side of the coin that starts to happen, right? Where there might be in some situations, for example, maybe turning more outwardly, in some situations turning more inwardly and such, right? So it's never necessarily black and white, but very important for our viewers to know that there can be these two categories,
Yeah, and I think it's also important to say here that there's a lot of overlap with certain personality styles. So, for example, if some of this is starting to sound like narcissism or other personality disorders or styles, you're probably on the right track in that they are emotionally immature people generally.
yeah, yeah, very much. So important to consider that. So let's talk about how this influences sibling estrangement, Fern. So I think that Gibson really helps to break it down when she talks about the role self, right? The people that tend to become chameleons or people pleasers within the family. And it really, I think that's one of the tragic outcomes that can start to happen, I think, right? With when it comes to the emotionally immature parent and such, is that the child will tend to try to accommodate their environment and such, right?
Right, it's a survival mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the true self, of course, that Gibson goes into is expressing your true authentic nature, which is often what we must contend with, I think, in sibling estrangement, right? When we're faced with wanting to belong at all costs at our own expense. And really, if we're not careful, as many of us have seen, right, this is what can happen. And we can learn really to come back to our true identities, especially when it comes to that, when we are exercising our true self. And I really think that that overlaps with a lot of what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that this stuff shows up in the family. And so I think you're going to see a lot of competition and comparison when you have emotionally immature parents. There's a lot of favoritism and scapegoating. And these are things we've talked about in other episodes as well. So some of this is rather predictive.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what makes this so easy for our community to understand because of that, because of the fact that this is very much of a pattern that we see within ourselves and within our interactions with our siblings. So I think that we're very familiar also, I think, with incompleteness, right? The concept of getting nothing that resolved and such, potentially with a sibling, because they refuse to discuss with us their grievances and such. So a
Right.
lot of times it might be associated to that level of emotional immaturity.
Well, and it's also that those communication skills were never modeled within the family, so they have no resolution skills. They don't know how to navigate differences,
Yeah,
and as a result, they are frozen in divide.
exactly. And that's a good point you're making, right? It's this idea that we talk about the parents a lot, but really it's the effect this has on some children that if you don't have those skills, then you're reproducing that. And if you're slightly more emotionally intelligent than your own sibling, then you're going to be seeing a lot of these different games play themselves out in front of you. And it's really, really important to recognize this. And I think that a lot of times that type of level of maturity is usually cultivated within oneself or is present already innately. That can happen, but it's also a learned behavior. And really, what's important is to be mindful that does your family have conflict management and such? Do is your family able to talk about the emotion focused approach and such with within themselves and with their children and such? That's really really important to highlight that because a lot of times the lack of accountability and repair is what's characteristic, I think, of sibling estrangement.
Well, and the parents are emotionally immature, and so they neglect their emotional needs of the children, and they dismiss their feelings and minimize their experiences. And as a
Yep.
result, the children don't know who they are or what they feel, and then they grow up and they're continued to be confused.
Exactly, right? So if that base, that foundation is not created or not stabilized or given early on, then you're forced to learn the lessons later on in life, or you reproduce that same impasse over and over again in different relationships, including your sibling relationship.
Which is the journey we're all on, trying to
Exactly.
educate ourselves on how these early life patterns are continuing to play out in our present day lives.
Absolutely. So it's so, so important to be able to connect the past to the present, especially, right? With how did we get to this point, right? What does it look like and such? So I really hope that today's episode was enlightening for our viewers, Fern, because we're almost out of time right now. And I just wanted to share that I'm really happy where we were able to go with today's episode because I think that we hear more and more about this, right? About the emotionally immature parent, and it's important that we put words to this so that our community here with sibling estrangement understands essentially what is the reality, how is it experienced, and such. So I hope that today's episode was helpful in being able to put words to this experience overall for us.
Yeah, I just want to close by saying there are real long-term effects to all this, like chronic mistrust and defensiveness, persistent envy and resentment, difficulty, as we said, communicating openly, emotional numbness, and estrangement from siblings and
Yep.
from even the extended family.
Absolutely. So, so important to look at what the fallout is of all this, right? And to recognize where did this start? How is this affecting us now? What direction do we need to go into to change and become the better version of who we are? So, so Fern, let's talk about resources. Tell me a little bit about what would be your number one resource at this time.
Well, I continue to coach and learn a lot with each session. I've
Mhm.
actually been doing more work with siblings who are struggling and trying to find common ground so that they can get past some of this. And I've had some success there as well.
That's wonderful. That's great, especially when people come to us and such and look for help. So my number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. That's again resuming for the new year, and people can get in touch with me to see if they'd like to participate and such. And it's really a safe space that people can go into to be able to be heard and to be seen, and also to have empowering direction and strategies that can be discussed to help better ourselves amidst the conflict of sibling estrangement within ourselves. So it's very important for people to know that this is a group going strong now for 5+ years. And there's really nothing else like it out there. So I would really like for people to join and be a part of this with me. I'm also doing a workshop on navigating the stages of grief with sibling estrangement, which will be happening at the end of February. So if people want to join me for this, then they can certainly reach out. They can go on the resource page, siblingestrangement.com/groups, and look into that and register if this speaks to you, because it's an important roadmap to follow to be able to navigate this particular type of grief. And I look forward to hosting this, of course, as I've done before, because it matters to me, just like it matters to you, Fern. So
Yes, we are healing the world one sibling relationship at a time.
that's greatly put. I appreciate that. That's very true. All right, Fern, this has been wonderful to be able to do this with you. Thank you so much again for getting together and to be able to shed some light on this important subject for today. I look forward to our next episode.
Me too. Thanks, Sally John.
Take care.